Well, first and foremost, I would like to thank you all for tuning in. My name is Huzaifa Shahbaz, and I serve as the Research and Advocacy Coordinator at CAIR National. The title of our latest report is Islamophobia in the Mainstream. And in this report, we attempt to examine the scope of Islamophobia in 2019 and 2020. And to assess the extent of Islamophobia, we look at 5 different aspects. Number 1, the funding of the Islamophobia network. And how do we define Islamophobia network? It is defined as an interdependent network made up of politicians, think tanks, scholars, religious groups, and activists that distort Islam and Muslims for monetary and political gain. And these actors raise millions of dollars, they testify before Congress, they train federal counterterrorism agents and coordinate grassroots campaigns to shift American public opinion against Islam. So that's number 1. Number 2, we look at the scope of school bullying, particularly against Muslim students between 2019 and 2020. And so we look at CAIR California reports, CAIR Massachusetts school bullying reports, and see what do those statistics look like nationwide. Number 3, we look at anti-mosque incidents. How frequent were anti-mosque incidents between 2019 and 2020, and what kind of anti-mosque incidents were they? Were they a vandalism? Was it a case of harassment? Was it a case of intimidation? So we look into those things as well. Number 4, we look at the spread of Islamophobia on social media by institutional leaders. Number 5, we look at Islamophobia within American politics, right? So politicians, the rhetoric of politicians, certain policies, things of that sort. And so our results show us that just how mainstream and acceptable Islamophobia has become in our society. And so now I'd like to go over some of the main findings of our report. So please give me a second. I'm going to share my screen for you all. Okay, as you can see here, this is the report. Again, it's called Islamophobia in the Mainstream. So I'm just going to go down to some of our main findings for you all. And so number 1, among the top 50 largest charitable institutions and foundations we reviewed, 35 of them funneled a combined total of $105,865,763 into 26 Islamophobia network groups. Number 2, Christian advocates serving evangelism, Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund, Schwab Charitable Fund, Marcus Foundation, the Adelson Family Foundation, and the Jewish Communal Fund were among the top 6 funders of the US Islamophobia network between 2017 and 2019 from the 50 largest charitable institutions and foundations we reviewed. Number 3, the American Center for Law and Justice received a combined total of over $60 million from Christian advocates serving evangelism between 2017 and 2019. And for those who don't know, ACLJ is a law firm which has a history of actually supporting anti-Muslim policies like the Muslim ban. In 2017, they filed a supporting court brief in defense of the Muslim ban. Number 4, CAIR school bullying reports from select states demonstrate that students continue to face physical and verbal abuse for being Muslim and do not feel comfortable expressing their Muslim identity and engaging in classroom discussions about Muslims and Islam. And as you'll see later, I'll show you exactly what those statistics are. Number 5, CAIR identified 16 anti-mosque incidents between 2019 and 2020, including incidents of damage, destruction, and vandalism, also known as DDV, intimidation, and harassment. Number 6, between 2019 and 2020, CAIR identified 40 instances where quote unquote institutional leaders shared or posted anti-Muslim content online. So how do we define institutional leaders? We define institutional leaders as individuals who hold the position of influence or power within our trusted institutions. So for example, it could be a school board member, or it could be a police chief. And just lastly, we looked at, again, Islamophobia and American politics, and we found that 7 individuals with a history of Islamophobia were either appointed or nominated to serve in the Trump administration. Now, I'd like to get your attention to the first part of the report, which is titled The Islamophobia Industry, Tracking the Funding Between 2017 and 2019. Here, I want to just go over the donor advised funds and how money has been poured from donor advised funds into the anti-Muslim organizations. And so, although anti-Muslim groups have become increasingly unpopular, they still receive large sums of money through foundations and donor advised funds, which are ultimately used to spread misinformation and perpetuate stereotypes about Muslims and Islam. And so a donor advised fund, or DAF, is a distinct form, is distinct from a private foundation or a public charity. At its core, it's a contractual relationship between the donor and the fund that guarantees donors an immediate tax write-off in exchange for their contribution, with no requirement, actually, that any of the contribution be put to active charitable use. With a donor advised fund, the contributor is frequently anonymous and thus impervious to scrutiny of their support of unsavory causes. In this way, a donor is able to mask their funding streams and make it nearly impossible to track charitable funding to its ultimate source. And so this lack of transparency poses a paradox. While DAFs ensure the secrecy of donor sources, they also impact public life by supporting charities that serve broad human and social services. So on the one hand, you'll see they're supporting, good, social services-based organizations, and for the better of humanity. But the other side, we see that they're supporting a lot of this money is going to anti-Muslim organizations without any sort of accountability. And so even one individual argued that ultimately donor advised funds are serving as pass-throughs to hate groups. And so I want to talk about how much money has been really poured into anti-Muslim organizations by some of these donor advised funds. And so one statistic you'll find is that the Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund poured close to $7 million into Islamophobia network groups between 2017 and 2019. And between July 2017 and June 2018, it gave the American Freedom Law Center over $1 million. The organization was founded by attorneys David Yerushalmi in 2012. In August 2017, the AFLC filed an amicus brief in the US Supreme Court in supporting President Trump's Muslim ban. And according to a report done by the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley, Yerushalmi's 2010 draft of American Laws for American Courts has actually served as a model for the enactment of 18 anti-Muslim laws in states in the US between 2010 and 2016. And so while some funds and private family foundations are ideologically aligned with anti-Muslim groups like the Adelson Family Foundation, it is important to recognize that donor advised funds are actually being exploited and abused by donors who seek to anonymize their contributions to anti-Muslim special interest groups and receive their tax benefits. And although there has been an effort to raise awareness about this abuse, including the Hate Is Not Charitable campaign, some have argued that DAFs have really exacerbated the problem because they've known about it for years. And they've exacerbated the problem of hate funding and have done little to implement best vetting practices of their participating donors. And again, ultimately, these donor advised companies are serving as pass-throughs to hate groups. And so there are things being done about this so far. There's an amazing organization called the Action Center on Race and the Economy. which have done a really big campaign called Unmasking Fidelity Coalition, in addition with the Hate is Not Charitable campaign, to hold Fidelity and other DAFs accountable for contributing to anti-Muslim organizations. And so I wanted to go over a few recommendations for DAFs that I think are worth noting. So maybe we can go down there and I can show you all what that looks like. And as you can see here in this report, these are the funders of anti-Muslim bigotry, and you'll be able to see in this report which foundations have given to anti-Muslim organizations and how much they've given. And so some recommendations I do want to point out here. So number one, charitable institutions should implement clear anti-hate policies and procedures to ensure funds are not granted to hate groups. That's a very simple policy that can be implemented by foundations and mainstream charitable institutions. Number two, interfaith communities and religious institutions should design and implement faith-based programs dedicated to marginalizing hate speech and anti-Muslim bigotry in local communities. Number three, philanthropic institutions should familiarize staff and stakeholders with the major actors and influencers in the Islamophobia network. And so CAIR is happy to talk to any of these philanthropic institutions to let them know about who these actors are, what kind of misinformation they put out there, and who to be really aware of in this space. Number four, organizations should investigate their grant-making procedures to learn if they're intentionally or unintentionally funneling money to Islamophobia network groups. And number five, philanthropic and religious institutions should hold educational initiatives for staff and board members to understand the scope of anti-Muslim bigotry and what constitutes Islamophobia. And just lastly, I think it's worth noting, what is the impact of this network? What does it mean for ordinary Muslims who live in the United States, who are just looking to practice their religion freely without fear of retaliation or Islamophobia? So one thing that the impact of this network is the spreading of false information about Muslim communities in the United States and beyond through social media, the press, public hearings, and other avenues. Number two, supporting of policies that negatively impact Muslim communities in the United States and overseas, such as the Muslim ban and the anti-Sharia hysteria that happened in early 2010s. Number three, the violent targeting of local Muslim communities, as we'll talk about soon, anti-mosque attacks and anti-Sharia demonstrations that happened and spearheaded by Act for America, another anti-Muslim hate group. And four, just special interest lobbying by leaders of anti-Muslim hate groups, including Frank Gaffney, who was the founder of the Center for Security Policy, a designated anti-Muslim hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, and was actually appointed to Ted Cruz's National Security Coalition in 2016. And so I want to just transition now and talk about some other components that we have in this report just briefly. And so I'm going to take you all to our next section here, Islamophobia and school bullying. As you can see here, CAIR school bullying reports from select states have clearly demonstrated that students continue to face physical and verbal abuse for being Muslim and actually do not feel comfortable expressing their Muslim identity and engaging in classroom discussions about Muslims and Islam. One report found that 48% of respondents experienced some type of bullying, including verbal insults, physical abuse, and cyber bullying. And so we looked at the CAIR California bullying reports. We looked at CAIR Texas, and we also looked at CAIR Massachusetts to really get a picture of what bullying looks like in our schools, right? We also saw that Tennessee House Speaker Cameron Sexton appointed an anti-Muslim activist, Lori Cardoza Moore, to the Tennessee State Textbook Commission. And as for those who don't know, Cardoza Moore is the founder of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, PJTN, which the Southern Poverty Law Center designated as an anti-Muslim hate group. And so Cardoza Moore led an opposition to a mosque in Tennessee and opposed a mosque in New York City, the Park 51. And on the Daily Show, actually, she claimed that 30% of Muslims are quote unquote terrorists and that there are already, quote, 35 training camps in America. And so these are the kinds of individuals that we are seeing serving on textbook commissions, school individuals who are responsible for material that is eventually going to go to our children, right? So it's important to be aware who these individuals are, what their background is, who they work for, and who's really funding them, right? And so you'll be able to actually learn more again about how much money has gone into these organizations. And so the next part I do want to go over is the anti-mosque incidents from 2019 and 2020. So from vandalism to harassment to intimidation, anti-mosque incidents continue to rise across the country despite increasing levels of security. And it's also important to note that many incidents go unreported due to fear of retaliation. And so anti-mosque incidents that we've included in this report are categorized into 3 categories. So we have DDV, which stands for damage, destruction, and vandalism, harassment, and intimidation. And so we found 9 incidences of DDV, damage, destruction, and vandalism of mosques. We found 1 incident of harassment, and then we found 6 incidences of intimidation. And we're not surprised. There's probably a lot more out there. Again, people do not report this information, but we do encourage everyone who's viewing this that if you are part of the Muslim community, you go to the mosque, and anything ever happens, please report it to CAIR. With this information is really important to us, and we want to make sure that we're monitoring and keeping track of this data, and so we can use data to fight for and lobby for policies to protect our communities. And so the next thing I do want to go over is the Islamophobia and social media. And as you can see here, between 2019 and 2020, CAIR identified 40 instances where institutional leaders shared or posted anti-Muslim content online. And again, we define institutional leaders as individuals who hold a position of influence or power within our trusted institutions. So for example, a school board member or a police chief. And so I wanted to give you all an example of what that looks like. And so I want to scroll and find, as you can see here, in San Jose, California, June 2020, on a private Facebook group named 10-70DSJ, a retired SJPD San Jose Police Department police officer posted a link about a Los Angeles police officer pulling off a woman's hijab or headscarf. His name was Mark Pimentel, an active SJPD officer who was recently documented policing protests while refusing to wear a mask, and commented on the post, quote, "Hell, I would have pulled it over her face." When another retired police officer posted about Black Lives Matter, calling them racist idiots, un-American, and enemies, Mark Pimentel again chimed in and replied, "Black lives really don't matter." Right. In 2015, Sergeant Chris Skiba posted a graphic image on his Facebook page, which stereotyped all Muslims as being terrorists. He's currently an SJPD trainer on. He was a SJPD trainer on race bias policing. And so these are the kinds of content and rhetoric we're dealing with. These are individuals that we entrust as our leaders in our community, whether it's a school board member, whether it's a police officer. We end up finding out some of this really disturbing content online that really shows a clear bias against Muslims and the egregious stereotyping of Muslims, which is really dangerous because we trust these individuals and institutions to impartially carry out their duties, right? And so we want to make sure that folks are held accountable, and we do expose the kind of rhetoric that we see coming from these institutions and individuals. Lastly, I want to just touch on Islamophobia and politics, which is our section 5, our last section. And so here we actually identified 7 individuals with a history of Islamophobia who were either appointed or nominated to serve in the Trump administration. And so before I go into who those individuals are, it's important to note in 2019, 2020, we saw that Marjorie Taylor Greene was running for Congress. And so as many of you who know, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene has a really ugly history of Islamophobia. And so she has been exposed multiple times for her anti-Muslim rhetoric. Just to give you all a few examples, she has suggested that Muslims do not belong in government. She thinks Black people are, quote, held slaves to the Democratic Party, called George Soros a Nazi. In reference to the 2018 midterms, she stated that it was part of an Islamic invasion of our government, and that anyone that is a Muslim that believes in Sharia law does not belong in our government. In 2018, she agreed with a Facebook commenter who claimed that 9/11 was, quote, done by our government. And again, so these are politicians who serve in a very trusted institution in Congress, who are supposed to make legislation that's supposed to benefit the American people, right? But clearly, we have politicians and individuals who have anti-Muslim bias, who are Islamophobic, who are pushing for anti-Muslim policies. We've seen attacks on Muslim congressional members, like her sister, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Andre Carson. And so this is a cycle that continues. And we really hope that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party really vocalize support for these for our Muslim politicians, for suffering through the kind of hate by other members of Congress. And just lastly, I want to show you all some of the things that we've noted here. So again, we've highlighted 7 individuals with a history of Islamophobia. One example here is that President Trump appointed Kayleigh McEnany as White House press secretary, who has a long history of actually defending and promoting anti-Muslim bigotry. In 2014, McEnany participated in a Fox Business News segment titled, quote, "How Big of a Threat is Islam?" during which she sat alongside a white supremacist, Proud Boys co-founder Gavin McInnes, and she repeatedly hyped the threat of extremism among Muslims, while McInnes argued that Muslims are prone to violence because of genetic defects caused by, quote unquote, inbreeding. In 2017, McKinney actually wrote an op-ed for The Hill decrying German Chancellor Angela Merkel and European nations for allowing Muslim refugees to enter their borders, which McKinney claimed resulted in a culture in crisis, a culture without democratic, freedom-loving identity and constantly under murderous attack from cancers within. And again, so you'll be able to look through this section and find who these individuals are, what they've said, the kind of rhetoric that they've had, and the positions that they were able to be nominated in by the Trump administration. Again, another individual here, it's Sebastian Gorka, right? He was appointed to the National Security Education Board, right? And he's been criticized consistently for his Islamophobic views, including once calling it religious profiling of Muslims, quote unquote, common sense, and declining on several occasions to say whether President Trump believes Islam is a real religion. He's also served as a frequent guest at events and on a radio show hosted by Gaffney, who is the founder of the Center for Security Policy, a DC-based anti-Islam think tank. And so it's clear overall. Our findings clearly show, that Islamophobia is systemic, it's mainstream, it is an acceptable form of bigotry, and so we need really clear policies to address Islamophobia at the systemic level, including passing the Combating International Islamophobia Act, implementing anti-hate policies in charitable institutions. And the Biden administration should vocalize opposition to Islamophobia and make an effort to get rid of discriminatory policies like the federal watch list and the no-fly list. And until we take the threat of Islamophobia seriously, we'll unfortunately see anti-Muslim bigotry on the rise. So thank you all for tuning in on these key findings of the report.